The galaxy would one day know him as Darth Stryfe, a warlord of the One Sith, the enforcer of an empire built on fear. But long before the armor, long before the rage, he was only a child. A small, quiet presence on a world that swallowed sound. Ziost was not a place where children laughed. It was a world carved from cold stone and ancient wounds, where the air itself felt tired from centuries of Sith rule. Snow did not fall softly here. It cut, it scraped against the skin. It sank into the bones and stayed there. Even the forests looked dead, their branches frozen in shapes that resembled clenched hands. This is where his life began, in a place that taught silence before it taught language. He had no name the day the Sith found him, not one that mattered. Names were for people who would grow into something gentle, something hopeful. Ziost did not nurture hope. It shaped weapons by taking everything else away. The boy belonged to a small settlement built around the ruins of an old Sith laboratory, a place whispered about but never approached. No one knew who his parents were, no one claimed him. He simply appeared one winter, carried into the settlement by a scavenger who found him wrapped in a thin blanket beside the frozen body of a woman. The villagers burned the woman's remains before nightfall. They never discussed what happened to her. On Ziost, death was not a mystery, it was an expectation. But the child survived, and that alone made some of them uneasy. He never cried. Even in the freezing nights, when the wind howled like a wounded animal against the cracks in the stone huts, he lay still and awake watching. His eyes were the first thing anyone remembered about him, cold, distant, as if he wasn't truly seeing the world, but studying it. And sometimes, flames flickered in the corners of the room when his emotions stirred. Small sparks at first, then larger ones. The villagers whispered the same word in fear, Sith spawn. But Ziost did not allow mistakes to live long. So when a group of acolytes from the One Sith arrived to collect potential recruits, the villagers offered the boy without hesitation. They handed him over as if they were passing off a curse. He didn't fight them. He didn't reach back. He simply stepped forward into the red and black robes waiting for him. The acolytes examined him for less than a minute before deciding he would be taken to the fortress. They didn't sense compassion. They didn't sense fear. They sensed something far more valuable, a cold fire, buried deep under layers of stillness. The kind of fire the Sith could shape, the kind of fire they could use. As they marched him across the frozen plains, the boy did not stumble or ask questions. He looked at the world around him with the same silent intensity he showed the villagers. Every broken pillar, every ruin swallowed by snow, every scar the Sith had carved into Ziost through centuries of war. He memorized all of it. He was too young to understand what the One Sith truly were, a rising empire built in the shadows, preparing to crush the galaxy under Darth Krayt's vision. But he understood one thing clearly. In this place, weakness was death, and he refused to die. When they reached the dark fortress between the mountains, the boy felt something stir inside him, not fear, but recognition. As if the cold stone halls and the pooled shadows were welcoming him home. The doors closed behind him with a sound that echoed like a final heartbeat. From that moment onward, the world would never treat him as a child again. He would not grow. He would be shaped, and the fire beneath his obedience would begin to burn. He never questioned why he was made to kneel, only that it hurt when he didn't. The boy's training began without warning. No introductions, no comfort, no names. In the fortress on Ziost, the One Sith stripped away what little remained of his past and filled the silence with commands. Strike, bow, obey. These words became his new language. spoken not with lessons, but with pain. He was not taught with words. He was conditioned with violence. Older acolytes beat him, not to punish but to see how long he could last. When he failed, he was starved. When he succeeded, he was ignored. Mercy was not part of the process, nor was reward. The One Sith didn't raise warriors. They forged instruments, and this child refused to break. His first kill came before he could speak fluent basic. Another boy, stronger, faster, arrogant. They were told to fight for food. Only one would eat. The other would feed the worms beneath the fortress. Most children hesitated. Most cried. Most tried to make sense of it. But he moved without thought, without anger, without fear. He snapped the other boy's neck and stood over the body in silence. And when the overseer placed the food in front of him, he didn't eat. He stared at it. That was the first time they took notice. Not of his strength but of his emptiness. He wasn't defiant, he wasn't loyal, he was simply there, unmoved, undisturbed, an open hand waiting to be used. Over time, his body hardened, his hands no longer flinched at pain. He learned to move through force drills with precision, striking faster than most of the older initiates. But it wasn't pride that drove him. He didn't care about praise. He only feared being forgotten. Darth Maladi, head of Sith intelligence, saw his reports and ordered that he be watched, not nurtured, not protected, just observed. There were whispers he might serve the One Sith someday not as a leader, but as a weapon. The kind of creature who would follow any command without asking why. He was never given a lightsaber. Not yet. He was told he hadn't earned one. But in the sparring rings, his fists drew blood just as easily. He didn't scream. He didn't roar. He fought in silence with a face that never changed, even as his opponents fell gasping to the floor. One overseer called him dead behind the eyes. Another said he was perfect. Years passed. The snow outside never stopped falling, and neither did the tests. In one chamber, he was locked with starving beasts. In another, he was made to kneel for hours before a frozen statue of Darth Krayt, reciting the Sith code until his voice broke. He never once asked what it meant. He only repeated it. There was no rebellion in him, no curiosity. But there was one thing the masters did not see, a hidden ember that never cooled. A memory, not of his mother, not of pain, but of being alone in the cold. And something deep inside had decided he would never be powerless again. Not because he wanted control, but because he knew what it meant to have none. And in the world of the Sith, power was not freedom. It was survival. He wasn't born a killer. He was shaped into one. And in doing so, the Sith created something dangerous, not because he hated, not because he believed, but because he had learned how to destroy without needing a reason. He would become the hand that never trembled, a perfect servant, a perfect weapon. But no one had asked if he wanted to be. He never screamed when they cut him. In the lower levels of the fortress, where the lights dimmed and the cold turned sharp, pain was used not as punishment but as instruction. It was there, in those darkened chambers, that the real lessons began. They told him pain was clarity, that it burned away confusion, doubt, weakness. That through pain, the Sith revealed their true selves. But for him, pain did not reveal anything. It only buried what was left. They opened his back with blades not once, but many times. Each time he failed to meet a standard. Each time he hesitated. Each time he questioned. They never gave him answers, only scars. When he was ordered to kneel for hours without motion, he obeyed. When he was made to spar against 3 older acolytes with no weapon, he obeyed. When they told him to break the fingers of a child who had once shared his food, he obeyed. Even as the boy cried, even as he begged, he obeyed. But not because he agreed. Not because he understood. Because he had learned the price of hesitation. They didn't want loyalty. They wanted reflex. And in time, he gave it to them. One day, he was summoned to the Circle of Lords not to speak, but to kneel in front of Darth Nihil. The Nagai warlord walked circles around him, eyes sharp like blades, voice cold as space. "You are strong," Nihil said, "but strength without loyalty is a mistake. Tell me who you serve." The boy said nothing. Nihil struck him, a single blow fast, brutal. His lips split, blood spilled. Still, he said nothing. "Who do you serve?" Silence. Nihil raised his saber. Not to threaten, to end. The boy looked up, not with fear but clarity, and whispered the only answer he had ever been taught. "I serve the Sith." It was enough. Not because it was true, but because it was empty. Exactly what they needed. From that moment on, the tests grew darker. He was placed in isolation chambers for days, no food, no light. He was buried alive in stone for hours, left to claw his way free. He was told that his mind was not his own, that pain would show him who he truly was. But even pain began to dull. The more they hurt him, the less he felt. Not numbness, stillness, as if every part of him was learning to exist beneath the agony, to observe it, separate from it. They broke his body, but never his silence. And the masters saw that as success. One of them remarked, "He is almost ready. He has no fear left." But they were wrong. There was one thing he feared. Memory, not of pain, but of that night in the snow, of the woman whose face he never saw, of the sound the wind made when it passed over her body. He didn't know if she had loved him. He didn't know if she had tried to protect him. But sometimes, in the space between orders and violence, he thought of her. And in those moments, he hated them. All of them. The masters, the overseers, the Sith. But hate was forbidden, too, not in word, but in truth, because real hate was dangerous. Real hate had purpose, and purpose could lead to rebellion. So he buried that feeling with all the others. The One Sith taught him many things: how to break bones, how to silence screams, how to survive in a world that would never love him. But they never taught him how to heal, only how to hide the wound. And that would be their greatest mistake. They gave him a new name. It wasn't spoken aloud. It wasn't announced in ceremony. It was assigned coldly, efficiently, like a weapon being catalogued. The instructors began referring to him as Subject 12. Later, simply 12. He did not resist it. By then, his given name was long forgotten. He had no memory of hearing it spoken. No one had used it since the day he left the snow behind. In its place was obedience. And behind that, something deeper. Silence. Not the silence of peace, but of erasure. The One Sith believed they were creating loyalty. But what they made was something far more dangerous. They made absence. 12 rose through the training ranks without friendship, without envy, without ambition. He did as commanded. He surpassed expectations. But no one looked for the boy beneath the bruises. No one asked who he was. He became invisible, even in plain sight. When new acolytes arrived, they whispered about him like he was a ghost, someone who had always been there, always watching. Older initiates avoided his gaze. Even the overseers kept their distance. He completed his trials faster than expected, killed without hesitation. endured without reaction. And yet, the Sith Lords did not praise him. They did not elevate him. He was not chosen for special training or public recognition. He remained where he was a weapon in the shadows, because there was nothing in him they feared, and nothing in him they loved. He was not angry, not broken, not hungry for power. He was a shadow that obeyed, and that made him forgettable. But what they could not see, what they had trained themselves not to notice, was that something had begun to shift within him. Not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly, quietly, like frost melting beneath a closed door. It happened in the quiet hours, when his training ended and the fortress fell into sleep. He would sit alone in the observation chamber, staring at the icy mountains in the distance. He didn't understand why. There was no logic to it. But sometimes he imagined walking into that snow again, alone, unarmed, free. It was not a plan, not a dream, just a thought. And for someone like him, a thought was dangerous, because thoughts became choices, and choices became cracks in obedience. Years passed. He outlived others, outperformed them. He was sent on missions, assassinations, retrievals, punishments. Each one he completed without failure, without identity. But deep within, something stirred. Not hope, not love, memory. A flicker of self, of the child who once survived the cold, who once refused to die. Not because he wanted to live, but because he didn't want them to win. One day, as he walked the long corridor beneath the Sith temple, he passed a broken mirror left behind by another initiate. He stopped, looked at his own reflection, and for a moment, just a moment, he didn't recognize the face staring back. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had never truly belonged to him. He wasn't 12. He wasn't the ghost. He was the boy they had forgotten to name. The one they had trained too well, the one they had turned into a perfect weapon, by removing everything but the fire. And in the hollow they left behind, that fire had begun to grow, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in silence, in stillness, waiting. They called him Darth Krayt, but few ever saw his face. He spoke from the shadows not as a man, but as a voice, a whisper across the Force, heavy with pain and certainty. His words were not questions, they were declarations, final, absolute. The One Sith did not rise from hope, they rose from ruin. And Krayt was their ruin made flesh. The boy once called 12 stood among them now, taller, stronger, quieter, no longer an acolyte, no longer a number. His scars had faded, his movements sharpened. He had no need for a name, but when Krayt summoned him, he was given one. Stryfe. It was not spoken like a title. It was spoken like a sentence. Krayt had no interest in disciples who sought power for themselves. He had seen what the old Sith became, consumed by betrayal, eaten from within. So he rewrote the code, rebuilt the empire, removed the idea of individuals. All who served the One Sith served him. Stryfe understood this better than most, because he had never known anything else. He was not raised in the old temples. He had no memory of the Jedi, no context for resistance, only the voice of Krayt, deep, broken, ancient, giving him purpose. You are not to question, you are to act. That was his first command, and Stryfe followed it. He was trained in direct warfare, not manipulation, in destruction, not debate. Unlike Wylock, who mastered philosophy, or Nile, who hungered for succession, Stryfe was a sword. meant to be swung, not studied, and the galaxy felt his edge. He led assaults against remnants of the new Jedi Order, slaughtered defectors, interrogated traitors with his bare hands. He did not argue. He did not hesitate. He only asked one question: where do you want the blood to fall? The other Sith saw him as reliable, but not brilliant, powerful, but not subtle. And in the throne chambers beneath Coruscant's underworld, Krayt watched him, not with pride, not even with trust, but with usefulness, because Krayt didn't need believers. He needed servants, and Stryfe never disappointed. Still, there were moments rare, quiet ones when he looked into Krayt's golden eyes and felt something he couldn't name. Not fear, not reverence, something else. There was pain in the Emperor, a deep, unspeakable pain. Not just physical, though his body was covered in armor and scars, but older, heavier, as if he carried the death of something ancient inside him. Stryfe did not understand it, but he felt it, and for reasons he couldn't explain, it made him loyal. Not because Krayt demanded obedience, but because, somehow, Stryfe believed that pain must mean purpose, and purpose was the only thing keeping him alive. He never asked about the origin of the One Sith, never questioned why the rule of two had been abandoned, never wondered what came before the red armor and the black eyes, because if he asked, he might see something he couldn't unsee, and Stryfe was not ready for that. He was content in the dark, content to follow, to serve, to be the blade in Krayt's shadow. But in the Force, no shadow stays still forever. His name was known now, Darth Stryfe, spoken by soldiers with fear, whispered by Sith with resentment. He wasn't clever. He wasn't charming. He didn't need to be. Because when orders were given, Stryfe acted before others even moved. He became Krayt's trusted enforcer, not in title, but in presence. When the Emperor needed something destroyed, Stryfe was chosen. When a target went dark, when a Jedi enclave slipped through the cracks, when the whispers of rebellion grew loud, he was sent. Not to hunt, to end. And he never returned with failure. He didn't seek honor in battle. He didn't speak of victory. He treated war like breathing, simple, necessary, unspoken. And the One Sith rewarded him with trust. But trust, among Sith, is not safety. It is exposure. He was given more responsibilities, more dangerous ones. Not just battlefields, but internal threats. Secret purges, disappearances. If someone in the Order began questioning Krayt's vision, if a Sith Lord whispered too loudly about autonomy, Stryfe found them and silenced them. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't want them. He only asked when. And that made him valuable. It also made him feared. The younger acolytes believed he could sense betrayal, that the Emperor had placed a piece of himself inside Stryfe, a fragment of will, watching, listening. Some even said he didn't sleep, that he stood awake in his quarters, unmoving, like a statue in armor, waiting for the next command. They weren't far from the truth. Stryfe had never known rest, only readiness. He lived in silence, in discipline, in unblinking loyalty. He had no friends, no rivals, only missions. But there was something beneath it all, a quiet question forming, buried under years of obedience. Why him? The One Sith had hundreds of warriors, dozens of powerful lords. Even among the hands of Krayt, the Emperor's chosen few, Stryfe was never the strongest. Yet Krayt continued to trust him. Was it because he obeyed without question, or because Krayt knew he never would? The thought was dangerous. It lingered. And then, one day, it grew. During a mission on Ord Radama, Stryfe was sent to extinguish a Jedi cell hiding among the ruins. It was routine, brutal, but simple. Yet, when he arrived, he found no Jedi. Only civilians, refugees, children. He received no follow-up order, only silence. So, he waited. And after hours of stillness, the message came. Burn everything. No explanation, no names, no targets, just fire. And Stryfe obeyed. He set the chambers alight. He collapsed the ceiling with the force. He listened to screams without moving. And when the ash cleared, when the last embers died, he stood among the dead and felt nothing. No guilt, no clarity, only that question again. Why him? He returned to Krayt in silence. Reported success, received no praise, only the next order. That night, as he stood alone in the meditation chamber, staring into the glow of the fortress lights, he remembered something strange. The way the children looked at him. Not in terror, in confusion, as if they didn't understand why death had come wearing armor. As if they didn't see a Sith, only a man who never hesitated. That stayed with him, not as regret, but as a question he didn't know how to answer. He was Darth Stryfe, the blade of the One Sith, the hand that served. But he was beginning to wonder if something had been lost along the way. Not power, not purpose, but the reason why he ever wanted either. The One Sith did not walk beside Darth Krayt. They walked behind him. He was more than their emperor. He was their belief system, their future, their fear. And fear, when left unchecked, becomes worship. Stryfe understood that better than anyone. He had never known a galaxy without Krayt's voice. Never studied the Jedi. Never read the old codes. He wasn't burdened by legacy. He was born into submission. But the closer he stood to Krayt, the more he began to notice what others could not say aloud. The Emperor was dying. Not quickly, not visibly, but deeply. The coral seeds implanted by the Yuuzhan Vong, meant to extend his life, were tearing him apart. His skin pulsed with unnatural movement. His armor hid more than pain. It hid infection, mutation, decay. Krayt preached strength through order. But Stryfe saw him in his moments of silence after the speeches ended. After the chambers cleared, he saw the tremble in his breath, the flicker in his presence, the weight of something even power could not cure. And in those moments, Stryfe didn't feel loyalty. He felt dread. Because if Krayt was the center of the One Sith, and if that center was crumbling, then everything else would fall with him. Stryfe never spoke of it. He didn't dare. But doubt began to creep in like fog across his thoughts. It didn't make him disloyal, only aware. He began to notice the others: Wyloch, who spoke in riddles; Nile, who stared too long in silence; Talon, whose eyes held questions she never asked. The lords were watching Krayt more closely now, not to serve, to prepare, and Stryfe stood among them, silent, still, wondering what loyalty truly meant when the one you served no longer resembled himself. It came to a head during the council meeting before the assault on Had Abaddon. Krayt stood before them, speaking of destiny, of purging weakness, but his voice faltered. Just once, and no one missed it. The room fell silent, not out of respect, out of fear. Stryfe didn't move, but inside, something shifted, not because Krayt had failed, but because he had shown something real, a crack. And for Stryfe, who had spent his life being shaped into perfection, that crack made him question everything. Why did he follow? Because he feared Krayt? Or because he didn't know who he was without him? Later, as he walked through the halls of the temple alone, he passed the ancient statue of Marka Ragnos half buried in red banners, forgotten by most. A reminder of the Sith's older age. An age of chaos, of betrayal. Krayt had promised a new way, one Sith, one order, one vision. But Stryfe was starting to see the truth beneath the red. Even unity can rot. He returned to his quarters that night and removed his armor. Not to rest, to breathe. For a moment, he looked at his reflection in the metal chestplate and saw the Emperor's shadow staring back. Not Krayt's body, but his presence, the voice that ruled them, the pain that shaped them. The man whose death would end more than an empire. It would end the only identity Stryfe had ever known. He clenched his fists, not in rage, in fear, not of Krayt, but of what might happen when the shadow vanished. He was a weapon, a servant, a name spoken in whispers. But in the quiet, he asked himself one question. What is a shadow without the figure that casts it? And he had no answer. He never doubted Krayt's orders, but he no longer believed in them. That change didn't happen suddenly. It was slow the way rust eats through iron. Quiet, inevitable. The mission to Zeltros was the final confirmation. Stryfe had been sent to punish a former ally who had failed to deliver a Jedi prisoner. A simple objective. Make an example. Leave no survivors. He did as instructed. He crushed the guards, burned the archives, executed the defector. But when he returned, Krayt's only response was silence. No feedback, no approval, no acknowledgement, and something broke. Not his discipline, not his service, but the illusion that any of it mattered. He wasn't part of a brotherhood. He wasn't defending an ideology. He was maintaining the illusion of order for a master who no longer saw him. That was the moment Stryfe realized what he truly was. Not a Sith, not a leader, just a tool, one that had been used so often, even the hand that wielded it forgot it was once forged in fire. From that day on, something changed in how he moved. His strikes were still precise, his missions successful, but his presence grew colder, more detached. The lords noticed. Niall watched him with narrowed eyes. Talon asked fewer questions. Even Wyloch, ever calm, began monitoring his assignments more closely. They feared he might turn. But Stryfe wasn't planning betrayal. He wasn't capable of that kind of rebellion. He didn't want to rule. He didn't want more power. He didn't want freedom. He just wanted to matter. And deep inside, he feared he never had. One evening, in the lower chambers of the temple, he stood before a young initiator boy who had failed a training exercise and was now being punished. The overseer ordered Stryfe to demonstrate discipline, to strike the boy down, to make an example. The boy didn't plead. He just looked up at him with wide, hollow eyes. Eyes that once belonged to Stryfe. He raised his hand, then lowered it. The overseer shouted. Stryfe didn't respond. He walked away. Not because of mercy, not out of kindness, because for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like following the order, and no one stopped him. Later, he stood in his quarters, alone in the dark, the silence around him as deep as space. He thought of Krayt, of the pain in his voice, of the fire that once guided him. He thought of Zayast, of the snow, of the boy who had survived because he refused to die. And he asked himself, what did I become? A weapon with no target, a believer with no belief, a shadow with no master. He was still loyal, still obedient. But it meant nothing now. Because obedience without meaning is not devotion. It is decay. And Darth Stryfe was beginning to rot not from injury, not from betrayal, but from the quiet collapse of purpose. In the halls of the One Sith, he still walked tall, still led missions, still bowed before Krayt. But inside, he was hollow, and the galaxy did not notice. Because even empty, he looked the same. The voice of the Emperor still echoed in his mind, but it no longer commanded him. It haunted him. And somewhere deep in the Force, a whisper began to stir, one that Stryfe had never heard before. Not an order, not a scream, a question. Who are you when no one is watching? And for the first time, he had no answer. The war was never meant to be clean. The Sith did not conquer with honor. They conquered with fire. Darth Stryfe was no longer a shadow behind Krayt. He had become something else, a name burned into the edges of every conflict. A warning, a presence, a consequence. When the One Sith declared their strike against the Galactic Alliance, Stryfe led the first wave of fire. Not with legions, not with fleets, but with certainty. They descended upon Mon Calamari without warning. The oceans boiled, the cities cracked, and in the screaming chaos, Stryfe walked calmly through the broken chambers of the planetary senate, lightsaber drawn, armor blackened by the smoke of his own doing. He did not look for survivors. He looked for silence. And he left the world in ruin. The message was simple: bow or burn. Some planets surrendered. Others resisted. The ones that resisted remembered Stryfe. On both Awi, he turned a Jedi ambush into a massacre by collapsing an entire mountainside with a single push through the Force. On Dak, he oversaw the execution of over 10,000 prisoners after a brief rebellion in the holding zones. He did not act out of cruelty. He followed orders. But the ease with which he carried them out began to unsettle even the other Sith. He never hesitated, never questioned, never spoke of doubt, because doubt, in war, could get you killed. And Stryfe was not ready to die. But for all his strength, there were things he could not see. There were movements rising beyond his reach, alliances forming, Jedi gathering. Resistance did not end. It grew. And in every corner of the galaxy, whispers carried the same name: Cade Skywalker, a rogue Jedi, a son of a fallen order, a boy touched by the dark and scarred by the light. At first, Stryfe dismissed him. One man, one blade, one ghost. But war has a way of revealing truth through failure. And for the first time in Stryfe's career, failure began to follow him. His assault on the Corellian shipyards ended in retreat. His efforts to capture Jedi Master Wolf Sazon resulted in 3 Sith dead, not the Jedi. And then there were the losses on Raltier. A mission meant to secure an ancient Force artifact ended with Stryfe wounded, and Cade Skywalker still breathing. Krayt did not speak to him after that. No punishment, no praise, just the silence of a master who had seen a shadow flicker. For the first time, Stryfe felt it not defeat, but displacement. He had always believed himself the sword. Now he wondered if he was only the handle, held until something sharper came along. The One Sith pushed forward. The war continued. Planets still burned. But under the weight of every victory, Stryfe felt something hollow take shape inside him. Because victory without meaning is just repetition. And repetition breeds questions. He told himself it didn't matter. That the cause was still pure. That the galaxy needed order. But in the ruins of each conquered world, he began to see something else. A galaxy that was learning to hate them. Not fear, hate. and hate could become legacy. He had once believed he was shaping the future. Now he wasn't sure if he was only delaying its arrival. And as more Jedi survived, as more rebels organized, as Cade Skywalker kept reappearing like a wound that wouldn't close, Stryfe began to feel the truth behind the war. They weren't fighting for the future. They were fighting to stop it. Arsus had always been a sanctuary, a place where the Jedi returned to remember who they once were. A world rebuilt after ancient fire, holding the last traces of an order that refused to die. Stryfe was sent to destroy it, not as a test, not as a message, as a necessity. If the One Sith wanted the galaxy to kneel, then the Jedi had to be broken at their roots. And Arsus was their last surviving memory of hope. The attack began before dawn. Sith dropships fell through the sky like burning stones. The forests shook, the mountains cracked, and the old library, once protected by generations of Jedi, lit up with the first explosions. Stryfe led the ground assault. He walked ahead of the troops, armor reflecting the flames rising behind him. He didn't shout commands. He didn't need to. Soldiers followed him out of instinct or fear. Jedi masters fought fiercely. Knights stood their ground. Padawans tried to protect the younglings. But hope dies quickly when the sky itself is falling. Stryfe cut through the defenders with precision, not emotion. A single swing, a single push, bodies falling like shadows across the temple floor. He reached the steps of the ancient Arsus Academy just as the final defensive shield collapsed. Beyond the smoke, he could sense them, the fear, the defiance, the stubborn will of a people refusing to be erased. And he walked into it. Inside the temple, holocrons shattered under blast of fire. Statues broken by the Force toppled in every direction. The walls, once painted with the history of the Jedi, crumbled under his boots. But even in the fire, he felt something familiar. An energy he could not name. A whisper of peace he had never known. He ignored it. A Jedi Knight confronted him near the central archive. Her blade burned a soft blue. Her stance calm, focused. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Stryfe didn't answer. He moved forward. She fought harder than most, but she was alone. And Stryfe had never lost a battle alone. When she fell, he stood over her, breath steady, lightsaber dimming. She whispered something before death took her. Not a curse, not fear, not even you deserve this. The words stayed with him, not because they were true, but because they were gentle, and he didn't understand gentleness. Outside, the battle had turned. The Jedi were falling back. Younglings were being escorted into evacuation ships. Masters retreated to hold the landing zone. Stryfe stepped out into the open, and the sky erupted. A massive shockwave rolled across Arsus, tearing up the ground and hurling debris in every direction. It came from above. A Sith warhead, one meant to end the fight entirely. The explosion consumed both friend and enemy. A tactic of total dominance. No survivors, no loose ends. Even Stryfe staggered under the force of it. He looked back at the academy and saw it vanish in a column of fire, its history erased in seconds. When the smoke cleared, the Jedi were broken. Not dead, but defeated. The survivors fled to the stars, carrying only fragments of what they once were. The One Sith celebrated. They had destroyed a symbol. But Stryfe saw something else. Amid the ash, among the broken temples and scattered holocrons, he sensed it. The Jedi were wounded, but they were not finished. And neither was the war. The Empire believed they had secured the future. But in the ruins of Arsus, Even Stryfe could feel it. This was only the beginning. He should have died on Ossus. That was the rumor. The Jedi boy. The Skywalker heir. Buried under fire. Crushed by loss. Broken by power. But Cade Skywalker did not die. He vanished. And Darth Stryfe was the first to understand what that truly meant. The Sith didn't speak his name often. Krayt had forbidden obsession. But even silence couldn't erase fear. Because Cade wasn't just a survivor. He was something else. Something the Sith could not control. A former Jedi. A bounty hunter. A lost son of a fallen order. He drifted across the outer rim like a wound that refused to heal. Stryfe was sent to track him. Not alone, but always at the front. He pursued leads on Nar Shaddaa, crushed rumors on Tatooine, and interrogated Force sensitives on Bastion. He followed cold trails and whispered reports. Each time, Cade escaped, not with cleverness, not with luck, with purpose. Wherever Cade went, the Sith followed, and wherever they followed, destruction returned. Stryfe began to notice the pattern, not of Cade's movements, of his effect. Rebellion surged after his sightings. Defectors whispered his name. Even some Sith began to question their path, their power, their master. And Krayt, once calm in his darkness, began to change. His orders turned sharper, his voice more brittle, his pain harder to hide. Stryfe could feel it in the Force, a shift, not in Cade, in Krayt. Because Cade wasn't just a threat. He was a mirror. The boy had seen death and crawled back. He had touched the dark and walked away. And Krayt hated him for it. Stryfe didn't speak these thoughts, but they lived in his mind, unspoken. He began to ask new questions. Why did Krayt fear a single man? Why did the future depend on killing him? And what did it mean if they failed? Then came Vendaxa. Cade was spotted near the ruins of an old rebel outpost. Stryfe led a small strike team to intercept him. This time, he was ready. This time, he would not miss. The ambush was brutal. Lightning carved the sky. Sith blades flashed in the dark. Cade fought like a cornered animal, furious, desperate, unpredictable. But not weak. Stryfe had faced Jedi before. He had broken masters, burned temples. But Cade fought with something else. Not duty, not revenge, with grief. And Stryfe felt it in every strike. For the first time in years, he struggled. Each movement met resistance. Each attack mirrored. Until Cade broke through. He didn't kill Stryfe. He wounded him. A deep, shattering wound across the chest. Through the armor, into the bone. Stryfe collapsed. Bleeding. Silent. The boy stood over him. Lightsaber drawn. Breathing heavy. He could have ended it. But he didn't. Cade looked into Stryfe's eyes and stepped back. He didn't speak. He didn't explain. He just walked away. And in that moment, Stryfe understood something terrifying. Cade Skywalker was not trying to win. He was trying to survive. And that made him unstoppable. The Sith would never break him. Because they didn't understand him. They thought power was fear. But Cade didn't fear death. He feared becoming them. And that fear gave him strength. Stryfe was pulled from the battlefield by Sith medics. He recovered in silence. Krayt said nothing. No praise, no rage, only silence. But in the dark of his healing chamber, Stryfe whispered one truth to himself. He's not the weakness. He's the proof we might be. He had always believed himself to be the blade. Unthinking, unfailing, unbreakable. But now, Stryfe was bleeding. The wound from Cade Skywalker ran deeper than the slash across his chest. It didn't just cut his body, it opened something inside him, something he had buried long ago. Doubt. For the first time, he was forced to confront the truth. He had been defeated, and not by a Jedi Master, not by numbers or superior strength, by a boy who refused to die. The One Sith told him to view it as a setback, a lesson, but Stryfe knew better. This wasn't a battle lost. It was a warning, because blades don't bleed. People do, and he was beginning to remember that he was not made of durasteel. He sat alone in his recovery chamber for days, silent, unmoving. The Bacta soothed his skin, but not his thoughts. He had served without question, fought without rest, obeyed without pause, and still he had fallen. What did that mean? What did it say about Krayt's vision? About the One Sith? About him? Krayt never came to see him. Not once. Not even a message. Only new orders. It was a silence more brutal than any punishment. Stryfe wasn't asking for kindness, but he had believed, at least, that his service meant something. Now he wasn't sure. He returned to the war as soon as his wounds closed. He killed again. He conquered again. But something had shifted. He was slower. Not in movement, in purpose. He no longer felt the fire in Krayt's words. Only weight. The Emperor had begun to speak more of legacy, of visions, of destiny. But Stryfe could feel the desperation behind them. Krayt was changing, or unraveling, and the Order was starting to fracture. Warlock whispered more often. Talon watched with careful eyes. Niall's silence grew longer with each council meeting. No one said it aloud, but Stryfe could sense it. The future was coming, and they were not ready. One night, he returned to his quarters after a purge mission on Kifu. The stars outside flickered. His armor still bore the ash of a rebel base. And he stood there in the dark, remembering Cade's face. That strange mixture of fury and mercy, of pain and control, of someone who had every reason to hate him, but chose to walk away. Why? He had asked himself that question 100 times, and each time, the answer felt more dangerous. Because Cade hadn't shown weakness, he had shown choice, and Stryfe had never had one. He had been taken, trained, shaped, and unleashed, but never asked, never allowed, never seen. He pressed his hand against the wound beneath his chestplate. The flesh had healed, the armor was whole, but the blade inside him had cracked. He was still Darth Stryfe, still feared, still deadly, but something inside had shifted. The blade could bleed, and now it had, and in that bleeding, something old had awakened. Not rebellion, not anger, memory of a frozen world, of a child who refused to die. Not for glory, not for Krayt, just to live one more day. That child was still inside him, and for the first time in decades, Stryfe listened. The throne room was silent, but it was not empty. Darth Krayt was gone. Dead, they said, though no one dared speak it aloud. Only whispers moved through the shadows now, and Darth Warlock sat where Krayt had once stood. It wasn't a coup, not openly. Warlock claimed authority with the voice of tradition calm, practiced, unquestioned. He did not declare himself emperor. Not yet. He said the will of Krayt lived on, through him. But everyone in the chamber knew what had happened. The order of the One Sith, built on unity, shaped by fear, had just been handed to a man who did not lead through power, but through words. And Stryfe felt the shift immediately. He stood at the edge of the council circle, arms folded, breath quiet. He had fought for this order, bled for it, killed for it, not for Wyerlock, for Krayt. And now, the one voice he had followed without question was gone. No battle, no farewell, no final command, just silence. Wyerlock spoke of structure, of continuation. He claimed the Sith must not fracture, that the will of Krayt was a living doctrine, not a man. But Stryfe was not trained to follow ideas. He had been shaped to follow him. And now the man who had given him purpose had vanished into memory. There was no ceremony, no mourning, only instructions. Wyerlock assigned new roles, redistributed commands. He wore Krayt's colors, sat in Krayt's place, but he was not Krayt, and Stryfe could feel it in every word he spoke. Something colder, something hollow. He obeyed. Of course he did. But inside, his obedience no longer felt like service. It felt like survival. The order moved forward as if nothing had changed. But the Force told a different story. There was a fracture beneath the surface, a crack in the foundation. The council meetings grew tense. Sith lords, once silent, began to watch each other more carefully. Talon said less, Niall said nothing, and Wyerlock smiled too often. Stryfe began to sense eyes following him, whispers behind closed doors, suggestions that he might not be as loyal as he once was. He had not spoken against the new leadership, but he had not praised it either. And in the politics of Sith survival, silence could be dangerous. He returned to his quarters more often now, not to rest, but to remember. He stood before the statue of Krayt in the lower hall, the one the new council had neglected, and for the first time in years, he felt lost. Not because he missed the man, but because he didn't know what his loyalty meant anymore. Was it to a name, to a doctrine, to a voice that was no longer there? Or had he always been alone in this? He didn't know, and not knowing was worse than defeat. Krayt had promised a future. Wyerlock promised order. But promises didn't hold the galaxy together. Faith did, fear did, and both were slipping. As he stood in the quiet, staring at the stone eyes of a master now gone, Stryfe asked himself a question he had never dared before. If I follow a lie, am I still loyal? He had no answer, only the silence of a throne that no longer belonged to the man who shaped him, and a voice in the dark, growing louder each day, telling him that the war wasn't over. It had just changed sides. It happened without ceremony. No battle, no declaration, no blood, just a word. Kneel. Darth Wyerlock stood before the assembled lords, wrapped in the authority of the man he had replaced. His voice was calm, precise. He spoke not as a traitor, but as a custodian. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply asked them to kneel, to acknowledge the new voice of the One Sith, to accept the will of the order continued, refined, corrected. Most did. Talon was the first. Niall, reluctantly. Others followed. One by one, the circle bent. And then, there was Stryfe. He didn't speak, didn't move. He stood still in the center of the hall, eyes forward, fists clenched. He had been taught to obey, to follow without hesitation, to act without fear. But he had never been told to kneel for a lie. He didn't hate Wyerlock. He didn't even envy him. What broke inside him wasn't pride. It was something older. Trust. The same voice that once whispered purpose to him in the dark was now silent. And this new voice, this smooth, polished, perfect voice, carried nothing but logic. It offered no fire, no pain, no clarity, only doctrine. Warlock spoke again. Stryfe, you were always Krayt's blade, a weapon sharpened by purpose. That purpose remains. The future is unchanged. Kneel and continue. It should have been easy. Just lower the knee. Just bow the head. Just obey. But Stryfe couldn't move. Because the command wasn't about loyalty. It was about erasure. To kneel now was not to serve. It was to forget. Forget the voice that forged him. Forget the pain that made him. Forget the belief, however blind, that there had been meaning in the blood. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a leader. He didn't want the throne. But something in him, something buried deep since Ziost refused to bend. He remembered that first lesson, long before lightsabers, before titles. Obedience without belief is not strength, it's surrender. Warlock watched him in silence. The other lords grew uneasy, not because they feared Stryfe's defiance, but because it reminded them of their own doubts. Stryfe stepped forward, just one step, then lowered to one knee. But his head did not bow. He knelt for the order, not for the man, and Warlock understood. He said nothing, only gestured. The council moved on, roles reassigned, orders given, but something had changed. Not in the room, in Stryfe. He felt it in his chest. A quiet break, not rage, not rebellion, just the knowledge that he had bent and still felt nothing. The word had done its work, not because it controlled him, but because it showed him who he had become. A blade that followed commands it no longer believed in. He walked out of the chamber slower than before, not in body, in spirit. He wasn't sure what had broken, but he could feel it, a silence deeper than obedience, a hollowness where faith once lived. He still wore the armor, still took orders, still fought in Krayt's name, but he no longer knew what that name meant. And now, when he looked into the eyes of the other Sith, he saw it in them too. The kneeling hadn't unified them, it had divided them. The order still stood, but something inside it was already falling, and Darth Stryfe, the most loyal of them all, was the first to feel it crack. The war didn't stop for betrayal. It never did. The Jedi still ran, the Alliance still bled, and the One Sith fractured or not continued to press their claim on the galaxy. Darth Stryfe led the next assault without hesitation. He followed orders. He destroyed resistance. He commanded squadrons with brutal precision. But inside, he was drifting, not backward, not forward, just away. The battlefield had become mechanical to him, calculated violence, stripped of belief. He no longer saw enemies, only targets. On Arcania, he leveled a mining colony suspected of aiding Cade Skywalker's rebels. No proof, no warning, no survivors. The fire turned the sky black. Stryfe stood in the ash of that operation, helmet under one arm, gaze unmoving as the wind swept scorched snow across what remained. The air tasted like silence, and in that silence, he heard it again. The voice that wasn't Krayt. Warlock's voice. Purpose is power. Doubt is death. He had once believed that. Now he wasn't sure if he understood it at all. In the following weeks, the signs of discontent grew louder. Sith agents began questioning the legitimacy of Warlock's commands. Some disappeared. Others simply stopped returning. A low, invisible tension crept through the order like a shadow no one would name. The structure still stood. The rules were followed, but every command echoed hollow. as if the voice giving them came from a mouth that didn't bleed. Stryfe received his next orders in person. Wywerlock stood before him, calm as ever. There was no threat in his voice, only clarity. "You are our blade, Stryfe. You do not question. You strike." Stryfe nodded, not out of agreement, out of muscle memory. And as he turned to leave, Wywerlock spoke again. "There are whispers. You walk too often in silence. Some say you are not as sharp as you once were." Stryfe stopped walking, not from fear, from recognition. It wasn't an accusation. It was a warning. He was being watched, not for failure, for hesitation. And that, among Sith, was worse. Later that night, he returned to the ruins of the Arcanian outpost. Alone, he walked through the scorched tunnels, past the melted durasteel, through the remains of people who had never raised a weapon. And for the first time in years, he dropped to one knee. Not in obedience, not in exhaustion, but in something closer to grief. He didn't cry. Sith don't cry. But he placed his hand to the ground, feeling the heat beneath the ash. And he whispered to no one. Why? The word didn't echo. It vanished. Because there was no one left to answer. Not Krayt. Not Wywerlock. Not the voice inside him. He had knelt in the council chamber because it was expected. Now he knelt in the ashes because he didn't know what else to do. Not out of weakness, but because his strength no longer had a direction. He had been taught that loyalty was a weapon, but no one told him what to do. When the hand that held him was gone, he stood again, not with purpose, not with anger, just the knowledge that whatever he was now, he wasn't whole. And in the cold wind of a burned world, Darth Stryfe began to understand that kneeling once does not break you, but kneeling with no reason leaves you hollow. Loyalty was never about choice. Not for him. It was carved into his bones, long before he understood what the word meant. It wasn't about belief. It wasn't even about faith. It was survival. And when the ones he served vanished, when the hands that shaped him fell silent, he clung to the only thing that remained: obedience. Wywerlock continued to command the order. Publicly, he claimed Krayt's vision as his own. Privately, he prepared to erase the man entirely. He rewrote doctrines, purged records, redefined what it meant to serve. The One Sith no longer needed a figure. They needed a direction. But direction without conviction is just movement. Stryfe watched it all in silence. He never opposed Wywerlock, never raised his voice, never reached for more. He simply followed, because that's what he was built to do. Even when doubt cut deeper than his lightsaber, even when the order began to rot from within, he obeyed, not because he trusted Wywerlock, but because he didn't know how to stop. His loyalty had become a scar not visible, not spoken, but always burning. And yet, beneath that scar, something waited, a whisper, the same whisper that had haunted him on Ziost, that had echoed in his mind on Ossus, that had stared back at him in Cade Skywalker's eyes. It asked the same question, again and again. What are you, if you're not commanded? And still, he had no answer. Then came the rumor. Krayt was not dead. Whispers from the outer rim. Fragments in the Force. Unconfirmed sightings. Distorted transmissions. Nothing solid, but enough to shake the foundation. Wywerlock dismissed it as false hope, a myth created to confuse the weak. But Stryfe felt it, a shift, like the storm before a lightning strike. If it were true, if Krayt lived, what would that mean? For the Order, for the future, for him. He didn't hope, he didn't pray. But something in his chest, something buried beneath armor and silence began to move. Not a belief, a pulse, because loyalty that never dies is not devotion, it's memory. And Stryfe remembered. He remembered the voice that had given him purpose, the shadow that had shaped his every action, the pain that had forged him into something the galaxy feared. He remembered a master who didn't just command, but understood. And for all of Krayt's cruelty, for all the war, for all the blood, he had never felt invisible under him. Warlock ruled with logic, but logic never saw him. If Krayt lived, then Stryfe's obedience had not been wasted. Then the blade had not been dulled. Then the silence that haunted him could end. But even as he clung to that idea, he feared it. Because if Krayt returned, so would judgment. And Stryfe didn't know if the man who knelt in the ashes was still worthy of the blade he once was. He waited for the transmission, for the voice, for the command, not with joy, not with fear, with readiness. Because the war was not over. The betrayal was not the end. And even broken, even bleeding, even lost, his loyalty refused to die. It lived in his silence, in his scars, in the fire that had never truly gone out. Darth Stryfe was not whole, but he was waiting, and the galaxy would soon learn what it meant when a forgotten weapon remembers what it was made for. They said he was dead, burned, broken, gone. Whispers claimed Darth Krayt had fallen, consumed by his own sickness, erased by betrayal, a shadow swallowed by his own order. And for a time, it was true. But death, for Krayt, was only a shape to break through, only another lie to conquer. When he returned, he didn't come with fire. He came in silence. No announcement, no proclamation, just a presence in the force so heavy that it bent the walls of the temple. A ripple that made the dark hum again. Stryfe felt it first. Before the others, before the alarms, before the footsteps and rumors and screams. He felt the cold, not from the wind, from recognition. He was in the meditation chamber when it hit him. A wave that sank into his bones like the memory of pain. And he knew Krayt had returned. Not healed, not whole, changed. When the doors of the high chamber opened, they did not swing. They were torn, and through them walked a figure shaped in armor, black as void, pulsing with crimson light. Not ceremonial, not symbolic, grown, fused, twisted. His body had changed, stripped of weakness, rebuilt through agony. His eyes glowed brighter than before. His voice cracked the air like a whisper that could tear stone. "I have returned," he said, and no one doubted it. Warlock did not kneel. He stood, confident, calm, prepared. He had ruled in Krayt's absence, directed the order, defined its future, and for a moment Stryfe believed it might be enough. That Warlock might speak with strength, and the two visions of the Sith might collide and shatter. But that moment never came. Krayt raised his hand, one motion, no warning. The air turned red, and Warlock fell, screaming, clawing, silenced, crushed by the force, by the will of a man who had defied death and returned with something worse than vengeance. He had returned with clarity. When it ended, there was no blood left, only dust. Stryfe watched it happen. He didn't flinch, because he felt something then he had not felt in months. Certainty. Krayt looked across the room. His eyes met each of theirs. Talon, Nile, the council, the guards. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Every heart in the chamber understood. The Emperor was not simply back. He had evolved. And what stood before them now was not the man they remembered, but the purpose they had forgotten. Stryfe fell to one knee, not out of fear, not out of instinct, but relief. The silence in his mind, the void that had eaten his purpose since Wylock's ascension was gone. The voice had returned, harsher, colder, clearer, but still him, still Krayt. The others knelt soon after, some slower, some shaking, but none stood. And in that silence, broken only by the echo of crushed stone, the future began to form again. Darker, sharper, unforgiving. Stryfe didn't know what Krayt had become. Only that death had not ended him. It had refined him. And that whatever came next would not leave room for doubt. The One Sith had always spoken of unity, of purpose, of structure, but now there was only Krayt. And his voice did not ask for loyalty. It demanded surrender. He addressed the Order just once. No long speech, no doctrine, only a single message carved into the minds of every Sith still breathing. The galaxy does not need many Sith. It needs one will, one vision, one power. Mine, the rule of one, had never felt so literal. What had once been a structure of lords, servants, and chosen hands, was now a blade, sharp, single, and in Krayt's grip. Stryfe stood at the center of it. Not by chance, not by ambition, by history. He had never questioned Krayt, never doubted, even in absence, and that faith was rewarded. He was given command of entire sectors, armies, fleet control, not as a gesture of trust, but as a test. Because Krayt no longer gave orders as a master. He gave them as prophecy, and prophecy demanded sacrifice. Stryfe obeyed. He burned rebel strongholds, hunted surviving Jedi, cut through systems that had once negotiated. No more compromise, no more subtlety, just control, total, immediate, permanent. But as the scale of his command grew, so did the weight behind it. Because Krayt's power was no longer hidden, it roared through the Force, a storm barely held together by will. And Stryfe could feel it pressing down on everything. His missions became more dangerous, the targets more chaotic. Rebellion didn't fade, it multiplied. The galaxy didn't kneel, it fractured. And in the cracks, Cade Skywalker rose again. Reports came in like static. A strike on a Sith outpost, a Jedi cell saved from execution, a voice spreading through the outer rim. Stryfe wanted to strike him down himself, not out of anger, out of necessity. Because Cade wasn't just a threat to Krayt, he was a challenge to the very idea of him. The boy who had escaped, who had defied the dark, who had lived without masters. Krayt called him a mistake, a wound, a fracture in destiny. Stryfe saw him differently, as a reminder that obedience was not the only path, that will could exist without control. But he buried the thought, because thoughts had weight now, and weight could crush. Krayt saw everything. His presence echoed through every corridor, every meeting, every moment of silence. Even when he was not there, he was. Stryfe spoke less, felt more. The fire in him, once shaped by purpose, now flickered with confusion. He had what he wanted: command, respect, clarity. But in the cold quiet of space, after the battles ended, after the stars stopped screaming, he began to ask, was this victory, or was it survival in another form? He remembered what it felt like to believe in something, and he wondered, If Krayt had brought that belief back, or burned it away completely, there was something different in Krayt's eyes now. It wasn't madness. It wasn't cruelty. It was focus, a burning clarity that had not existed before death. As if the pain that once tore him apart had become his fuel. He no longer sat on the throne. He stood, he moved, he hunted. Meetings were shorter, plans more direct, failures punished faster. The council barely existed anymore. Their voices muted, their influence shattered. Even Nile, once poised to inherit Krayt's legacy, stood like a shadow now, darker but smaller. Talon obeyed with perfect discipline. The other lords drifted inward, their ambitions buried beneath fear. But Stryfe watched. He didn't flinch from Krayt's gaze. He didn't question orders. But he noticed. Krayt no longer ruled with vision. He ruled with fire. And fire doesn't ask questions. It consumes. The Emperor's body, reshaped by the dark side, seemed less like a man and more like a vessel, one barely containing something ancient, unstable, and terrifying. His armor pulsed with crimson veins. His movements were precise but unnatural. Every step he took left a presence in the Force like heat rising from molten rock. There was no more talk of uniting the galaxy. No more philosophy. No more legacy. Only domination. Only survival. He demanded results that bordered on impossible. Entire systems pacified in days. Jedi enclaves found and extinguished. Rebel sympathizers rooted out before they spoke. Stryfe executed every order. He led surgical strikes through Sith space. He broke insurgent cells with mechanical precision. He turned battlefields into silence. But with each success, he felt it. The cold, not from failure, from purpose, draining away. Because under Krayt's gaze, nothing mattered except obedience. There was no room for belief, only compliance. And deep in the corners of Stryfe's mind, in the cracks that never fully healed, the question began to stir again. What am I, when I no longer believe? He didn't speak it, didn't write it, but it haunted him. He would stare at his armor in the quiet hours, dented, burned, still stained from osses, and feel nothing. Not pride, not guilt, only emptiness. The kind that eats from within. He had been given power, recognition, trust, but not identity, not truth. He thought of Cade more often now, not as an enemy, as a mirror, a Jedi who had walked through the same fire and chosen a different path. A man who knew who he was even when everything else was lost. And Stryfe had never been allowed to ask. The One Sith had taught him how to serve, how to strike, how to kneel, but they had never taught him how to exist without command. And now, under Krayt's burning eyes, he wondered if they ever meant to. Because fire does not shape, it devours. And Krayt, the man who had once given him purpose, now ruled as something else. Not a master, a force, unstoppable, unquestioned, unforgiving. Stryfe still obeyed, still fought, still led. But in his silence, he began to feel something even more dangerous than doubt. Recognition that the fire, in Krayt's eyes, was the same fire consuming what was left of him. Command was never about control. Not truly. It was about presence. The ability to move others not just with fear, but with belief. Stryfe understood that once. When Krayt first shaped the Order, there had been direction, certainty. Even in darkness, there had been purpose. But now, that purpose was gone, replaced by fire, by speed, by silence. Stryfe issued orders every day. To fleets, to assassins, to lords who now bowed without question. He was Krayt's instrument again, sharper than ever. Promoted, trusted, feared, but not seen. Because Krayt didn't see individuals anymore. He saw outcomes. Every soul in the One Sith had become a number, a tool, a cog in a design only he could understand. And Stryfe had become the most efficient cog. But in that efficiency, something inside him unraveled. He led a purge on Salukami, a swift, clean operation against a hidden Jedi cell. No resistance, no survivors, no hesitation. Yet when the mission ended and the smoke cleared, he walked alone through the ruins of the outpost and felt nothing. Not triumph, not clarity, just silence. He stood in a corridor lined with broken lights and scorched durasteel, watching his reflection flicker in the damaged wall. He didn't recognize himself, not because of age or wounds, but because there was no one left behind the eyes. Just a function, a shadow, a result. And in that moment, he remembered the first time he was given command. Not after Krayt's return. Long before, when he stood before a squad of initiates, young, afraid, hopeful, and was told to lead them into their first real battle. He had looked into their eyes and understood them. Now, when he looked at his own troops, he saw ghosts, not because they were weak, but because he had become what they would become, stripped of choice, shaped into silence, trained to forget who they were. Command without a soul. He didn't speak of it, didn't question. He returned to the fortress, filed the report, stood before Krayt. The Emperor said nothing, only stared, not like a master, like a storm watching a drop of rain. And Stryfe realized something terrifying. He had been loyal, he had been faithful, but he had never been important, just useful. And usefulness, in Krayt's new world, was not identity. It was expiration. He left the chamber without a word, walked past the guards, through the silent corridors of the temple, and somewhere deep within, in the place where memory still lived, he whispered the words he once feared most. I don't know who I am anymore. No one heard. No one needed to. Because the voice inside him, the one he once thought was Krayt's, was quiet now. Not dead, not gone, but listening. Stryfe still fought, still killed, still followed orders with perfection. But something in him had shifted, something small, something dangerous, because he no longer served to be seen, no longer obeyed to be trusted. Now, he obeyed because he had nothing else to hold. And that made him more deadly than ever. Not because he was loyal, but because he had nothing left to lose. And in the Empire Krayt had rebuilt, that kind of weapon was both a gift and a threat. There was no strategy, no politics, no diplomacy, just a name, a planet, and an order. Had Abaddon. Stryfe received the command in silence. No mission briefing, no objectives, just one line burned into the datapad. Purge the resistance, leave no survivors. It didn't say who the enemy was. It didn't matter. The planet had once been a site of imperial negotiation, a place where peace treaties were signed, where factions laid down arms. Now, it was red with smoke and split open by war. The Galactic Alliance had returned there in desperation, hiding beneath old structures, rebuilding defenses among ruins, trying to turn the past into a shield. Krayt would not allow it. He didn't want the Alliance crushed. He wanted them erased. Stryfe led the assault without hesitation. 3 capital ships in orbit, multiple dropships filled with Sith troopers, and a squad of Force wielders loyal to the blade, not the throne. They descended like a storm. No warnings, no transmissions, only fire. The outer rim of the capital fell in less than 2 hours. Civilians fled into the underground tunnels. Alliance fighters scrambled to hold choke points. But the Sith didn't come to fight fair. They came to burn. Stryfe moved at the front, his armor blackened by soot, his saber glowing like a wound. He didn't speak to the soldiers. He didn't coordinate with command. He simply advanced. Every door that closed was torn open. Every shelter became a grave. Every act of resistance was met with finality. He didn't pause to ask who was guilty. Didn't distinguish between soldier or civilian. Krayt had given him a command, and Stryfe obeyed, because that was what he had always done. He led a strike through the eastern quarter, cutting through blockades, collapsing buildings onto resistance cells. The Force cracked open vaults, twisted machinery, broke through iron and concrete alike. The city burned from the inside out, and he kept walking. At one point, a small group of rebels surrendered, hands raised, weapons dropped. They begged for mercy, offered information, even names. He nodded once, then killed them, quickly, cleanly, without hate, because the order did not say defeat. It said purge, and Stryfe had forgotten how to do anything else. In the heat of it, he did not feel rage, not pride, only movement, the weight of action without thought, the rhythm of power without belief. He was the edge of the Emperor's will, nothing more. But as the sun dipped below the broken horizon, casting the ash-choked sky in deeper red, something shifted. A scream echoed through the ruins. Not a battle cry, a child. He paused, just for a second, turned toward the sound, and saw them, a boy and a girl, no older than 10, huddled beneath a crumbled pillar, faces streaked with soot and terror. They weren't holding weapons. They weren't wearing uniforms. They were just there. He stepped toward them. One of the troopers raised his rifle. Stryfe held up a hand. "No," he said, "just once." Then turned away, not out of mercy, not out of guilt, out of confusion, because for the first time in days, something had pierced the rhythm. A pause, a question he didn't know how to answer. He kept walking, left the children behind, never looked back. But the sound of that scream stayed with him, not as weakness, as memory, and on had Abaddon, a world meant to be silenced. It was the only thing that echoed. By the third day, the city was no longer standing, but it hadn't fallen. Not truly. The towers were gone. The streets cracked open. The power grid failed. But the people still fought. They hid in shattered basements, struck from shadows, refused to run. Stryfe watched it unfold from the upper balcony of the command post, an old Alliance comm tower half swallowed by flame. The resistance wasn't strong, wasn't strategic, wasn't even organized. It was stubborn, and that made it dangerous, because a broken enemy doesn't fear death. They've already lost everything. The reports came in piece by piece. Scout teams missing, supply runs ambushed, troopers refusing to enter certain sectors without backup. Not because of Jedi, not because of traps, because of the people. Civilians who had picked up blasters from their dead. Engineers who wired bombs into fuel lines. Teenagers who hid in ventilation shafts with knives. It wasn't war. It was desperation. And somehow, they were winning. Not on the map. Not in numbers. In spirit. The Sith were growing tired. Wary, they began burning entire zones to root out resistance. Block by block, room by room. No survivors. No questions. And still, the fire did not spread fast enough. Stryfe ordered a direct assault on the central district. A full push. He led it himself. Tunnels collapsed. Barricades fell. Dozens died in minutes. But something in the force resisted. Not a wall. Not a weapon. Will. Raw, unshaped, untrained will. It pressed back against him like a tide, refusing to break. He couldn't see its source, couldn't cut it down, but he felt it. A pulse running through the ruins like a heartbeat. He struck harder, faster, until he reached the core of the resistance. A hollowed-out medical station turned shelter. Inside were no soldiers, only survivors. Wounded, elderly, children. A doctor raised her hands. "We're not part of it," she said. "We're just trying to save who we can." Stryfe looked around. There were no weapons, no fortifications, only beds made of scrap, and silence. He could hear breathing, fear, but not pleading. They weren't begging for mercy. They were daring him to continue. He raised his hand. The force swirled in his palm, ready to crush the walls, the bones, the voices. But he didn't move, because in their eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Defiance without anger. It confused him. He turned without speaking, left the shelter intact. The troopers hesitated, watched him go. No one followed. That night, he walked alone along the edges of the ruins. No helmet, no weapons. He stared at the wreckage, the smoke, the twisted bodies, and asked himself, why does this still stand? Not the city, not the buildings, the people. How could something so fragile refuse to break? He remembered Had Abaddon from maps and orders. Coordinates, troop markers, primary targets. But now, it wasn't a mission. It was a question. What does it mean to win, if even fire can't take their will? He didn't sleep that night, didn't meditate. He just stood in silence. And for the first time in the siege, he felt less like a commander, and more like an invader. Not of a world, of something deeper. And whatever it was, it hadn't broken yet. The siege ended without a signal. There was no surrender, no final charge, no raised flags, just exhaustion. The last shelter was cleared on the 8th day. The final skirmish faded into smoke, and the screams stopped. But it didn't feel like victory. Stryfe stood at the edge of the impact zone, a crater where the government tower had once loomed over Had Abaddon's capital. Now it was just rubble. Cracked directe. Ash where stone used to be. The wind had returned, dry, empty. It moved through the streets like it was searching for something. There were no more orders, no more enemies, just the sound of distant flame. Stryfe removed his helmet. He hadn't done that in days. The air smelled of metal and smoke, faint traces of blood beneath it all. He looked down at his gloves. Dirt and plasma marked the edges, too much for even armor to hide. He walked. Not to inspect, not to command, just to move. Troopers saluted as he passed. He didn't look at them. What would he say? They had done their job. Obeyed, executed, just like him. He found himself near the ruins of the old hospital, the one he had spared. It was gone now, destroyed during a secondary sweep. Not by his hand, not by his word, but still gone. He stood in the empty lot where it had once stood. No markers, no bodies, only blackened ground. He thought of the doctor, the quiet, the refusal to fear, and he wondered if they had made it out. He doubted it. The Sith didn't leave survivors, even when they weren't looking. Across the horizon, the city lay silent, not peaceful, just empty, and Stryfe began to understand something he had never been taught. That silence was not a reward, it was a cost. The Jedi hadn't stopped them. The Alliance hadn't defended the city. And yet, something had been lost in that victory, something he couldn't name. He returned to the command center hours later, sat alone in the strategy room. The lights flickered, the displays glitched. He didn't activate them. There was nothing left to plan. A message awaited him, encrypted, from Coruscant, Krayt's seal. He opened it, no voice, just text. You have done well. The fire spreads. Return. That was it. Commendation without meaning, purpose without feeling. He closed the file, leaned back in the chair, stared at the ceiling, and asked himself, did anything survive this? Not the buildings, not the people, him. He felt tired in a way the Force couldn't fix. The kind of tired that came from carrying weight that wasn't yours. He had burned cities, crushed rebellions, cut down Jedi without hesitation. But now, in the silence after the fire, he felt nothing. No rage, no pride, no clarity. Just a question. Was he still a weapon? Or had he become the ash that followed one? He stood slowly, put the helmet back on, walked out without speaking. The ship awaited, the galaxy awaited, Krayt awaited. But behind him, had Abaddon didn't mourn. It didn't cry. It just stood broken, burned, and stubbornly quiet. And that silence followed him into the stars. The shuttle lifted from the ruins of Hand Abaddon. No cheers, no honor guards, only the low hum of repulsor lifts over a dead world. Stryfe didn't speak during ascent, didn't look back through the viewport. He already knew what was there. Smoke, shadows, and silence. He removed his helmet and placed it on the bench beside him. The armor around his neck groaned as it shifted, streaked with soot from the last collapse. His hands rested in his lap, still, not shaking, but something inside him moved. Not rage, not sorrow, a quiet churn. The kind of motion that precedes a question no one wants to answer. He closed his eyes. The memory returned faster than expected. The scream, the one he'd heard in the eastern ruins. The children, the hesitation. He had walked away, let them live, or left them to die another way. He didn't know. He wasn't sure what was worse. He'd convinced himself, over and over, that obedience was survival, that orders were shields, that doubt was weakness. But now he wasn't certain, because something had followed him from the ground. Not guilt, not fear, a fracture, one that no armor could seal. He reached for the Force, not to fight, not to control, to listen, but it didn't answer like it used to. It felt heavy, not dark, just hollow, like a tunnel without end. Hand Abaddon had been a test, but not of strength, not of command, a test of meaning, and he had failed, not because he hesitated, but because he didn't know why he hadn't. He looked at his gloves again. The blood had dried, the soot had settled, but the weight hadn't left. And that terrified him more than anything, because strength, when it loses its reason, becomes something else. Noise. He remembered the early years Ziost, the fortress, the voice of Krayt when it still had shape. He remembered following without question, killing without pause, believing in the structure of power. And now, All of it felt like scaffolding built on smoke. Had Abaddon hadn't broken him, it had revealed him. A weapon too well used to know what it was protecting. A commander whose victories left him emptier than defeat. The shuttle docked with the capital ship. He rose without speaking, put the helmet back on. The soldiers greeted him with respect. The officers saluted. He nodded, but said nothing. Returned to his private quarters. Locked the door, Saturday, and breathed. He didn't reach for a report. Didn't activate the holomap. Didn't replay the mission. He just sat in the dark and thought, if I cannot feel the cost of what I've done, does that make me strong? Or something far worse? There was no answer. Only the low hum of engines, and the silence of a soul that had forgotten how to speak. But deep inside, beneath the armor, beneath the title, beneath the years of blood and command, the question remained. The doubt did not die in the ashes. It lived, quiet, small, but still breathing. And Stryfe knew, for the first time in his life, the greatest threat to his power was not an enemy outside, but the voice inside, asking why. He didn't chase him anymore, not directly, not as he once did, but Stryfe still watched Cade Skywalker, from a distance, through transmissions, battle reports, fragments of surveillance footage from half-destroyed outposts. The boy had become something else. Not a Jedi, not a Sith, something in between, unclaimed, unbroken, and Stryfe didn't know what to call it. He read the reports without expression. Cade striking down Sith on Daluuj, freeing prisoners from Bimiel, turning entire systems away from Krayt's control with nothing but defiance. He should have seen him as a threat. But what he saw instead was a question. How does he move without chains? Stryfe had always known what he was. A blade, a servant, a shadow behind the Emperor's fire. But Cade wasn't behind anyone. He wasn't serving anyone. And still he burned. Not with rage, with conviction. That confused Stryfe more than anything. He had been taught that order required obedience, that freedom without structure led to chaos, that power without purpose was weakness. But Cade had no master, no throne, no cause, and yet the galaxy followed him. He walked into battles without guarantees, made allies of smugglers and Jedi, challenged Krayt not through strength but through refusal. Stryfe began to replay the footage more often. Alone, in silence, he didn't analyze tactics, didn't study patterns. He watched Cade's face, the stillness in it, the pain that never turned into hate, the quiet rage that wasn't wild, just free. And something inside Stryfe shifted. Not envy, not admiration. Something older, memory, of standing in snow as a child, of obeying because no one had ever asked him who he was. Cade had been given that chance, and he had taken it. Stryfe didn't speak of these thoughts. He buried them beneath layers of armor and command. But they lived in him now. They followed him onto ships, into mission briefings, through blood and fire. Every time he struck down a rebel, every time he silenced a voice, he wondered if they had seen Cade first, if they had chosen this path because someone else had refused to kneel. Krayt never mentioned the boy by name. He spoke of fractures, of traitors, of unfinished lessons, but never of the man who would not die. And Stryfe understood why. Because Cade was not a threat to Krayt's body. He was a threat to the belief that anyone truly belonged to him, that the chain could never break. And now, Stryfe wasn't sure if it already had. He sat in the dark of his quarters late, one cycle. Hologram paused in mid-frame, Cade walking away from a burning outpost. Not running, not hiding, walking, head high, eyes forward, alone. And Stryfe asked himself, what would I be if I had done that? He didn't know, because no one had ever given him the chance. The One Sith had taken that moment, the choice, and buried it. But now, through the smoke and silence, he saw a version of himself that might have walked away too. Not from duty, not from strength, from the silence that had never let him speak. And that was more dangerous than any lightsaber. Control was everything to the One Sith. Control of the galaxy, control of the Force, control of fear. But Cade Skywalker didn't live by control. He moved through chaos and somehow made it obey him. Stryfe couldn't understand it. He had spent his life sharpening discipline into survival. Every breath, every strike, every thought had been shaped to serve order. And yet, Cade didn't serve. He decided. He didn't need a code, didn't need permission, didn't need Krayt. And somehow, the galaxy didn't fall apart around him. Stryfe was on a starcruiser above Renvar when the new report came in. Another strike this time. Cade had hit a weapons transport intended for Sith purification teams. Slipped past 4 capital ships, sabotaged the convoy, evaporated before anyone could catch him. Krayt was not pleased. His rage rolled through the Force like a pulse of heat. Even across systems, Stryfe felt it. Not just anger at loss, but hatred at defiance. Because Cade had not just escaped again. He had acted without consequence. And that broke every rule Krayt lived by. Stryfe was summoned. The chamber was colder than usual. Darth Nihil stood silent to one side. Talon remained on her knee. Only Krayt spoke. Find him. Break him. Not capture. Not convince. Break. That was the word Krayt used now. It wasn't about bending Cade. It was about proving that no one could exist outside his will. Stryfe nodded, but something in him resisted. Not the order. The reason. Because for the first time, he wasn't sure if Cade was the one being hunted, or the one Krayt feared. He left the chamber and walked alone through the lower levels of the temple. Past the statues, past the scars. He remembered what Krayt had once promised. Unity, strength, peace through control. But this was desperation. A man clawing at a truth he couldn't erase. That someone had learned how to live without him. And Stryfe couldn't stop thinking about it. He reviewed Cade's movements, his decisions, his recklessness, and realized something strange. Cade wasn't trying to win. He was trying to stay free. That was it. He fought not for conquest, not for rule, but because he refused to kneel. And Stryfe, who had spent his life on his knees, felt the impact of that deeper than he wanted to admit. He returned to the war table, assigned a new pursuit team, picked the fastest ships, the most aggressive trackers. But even as he signed off on the operation, he paused. His name was on the order, and it meant nothing, because he wasn't leading it. He was following a command, chasing a flame that would never go out. Later that night, he stood in the training chamber alone, saber ignited, movement sharp, but each form felt heavier, each strike slower. He wasn't tired. He was conflicted, because he wasn't sure anymore if killing Cade would stop anything, or if it would only prove that Krayt's vision required silence to survive. Cade was noise, and Stryfe had spent years in silence. But now, he wondered which one felt more alive. He remembered a time before silence. Not clearly, not fully, just fragments. A spark in the cold, a scream not yet suppressed, a thought still untouched by obedience. Stryfe sat in the darkness of his private chamber. No lights, no armor, only stillness. Cade Skywalker wasn't the only thing haunting him now. It was memory. The kind the Sith tried to burn out, but never fully could. He remembered Ziost. The snow, the way the cold bit harder than pain. How he'd survived by not feeling, by making the fire burn inward where no one could see it. That fire had once been his. Before Krayt, before the title, before the war, he hadn't surrendered it. He'd had it taken. Not with violence, with silence, with lessons that taught him to kneel before asking, to kill before questioning, to believe in nothing except the next command. But Cade was different. Cade's fire never left him. Even in darkness, even in despair, he carried it in his eyes. Stryfe saw it every time he watched those fragments of holo footage. In the way Cade stood after the smoke cleared. Not triumphant, just unbroken. Stryfe had been powerful longer, more trained, more feared, but Cade had something he did not. Ownership over his actions, his failures, his strength. He chose his path, even when it hurt. Stryfe never had the chance. He had obeyed, because it was the only way to survive. But now, he wasn't sure what he was surviving for. He remembered the first time he felt power. Not during training, not in war, but when he refused to cry in the cold. When the overseers broke his ribs and he stood back up, not because they told him to, but because he chose not to fall. That was his fire, the first and only moment of ownership he had. And it had been stolen, replaced by doctrine, by ranks, by silence. He stood now, in the quiet, and tried to feel it again. That heat, that refusal, but there was nothing, just discipline, form, control. The armor fit perfectly, but it no longer felt like his. He walked through the halls of the temple, past the statues of Sith lords who had long since burned out. None of them smiled, none of them looked free, and he began to wonder, what if power without freedom is just a prison? The One Sith had taught him that fire was dangerous. That passion led to chaos. That strength required suppression. But Cade burned without losing himself. And that felt like something no one had ever offered him. He didn't want to be Cade, didn't want to run, but he did want something Cade had kept, a memory of who he was before the darkness got too loud, before the armor, before the war, before the silence became him. He stood before the mirror in his quarters, looked at his own eyes. They were still, unmoving, but deep within them, a flicker, faint, unshaped. But there, a fire that hadn't died, just hidden. And Stryfe, apprentice of silence, commander of death, loyal blade of the One Sith, took one breath, closed his eyes, and remembered the boy who had once refused to kneel in the snow. He didn't speak during the council meeting. Not when Darth Krayt laid out the next wave of planetary purges. Not when Talon requested additional forces. Not when Nile questioned strategy. Stryfe remained silent, as always, but this time the silence felt different. Not passive, not obedient, waiting. Krayt's voice rolled through the chamber like thunder behind steel. Impossibly calm, terrifyingly direct. There was no room for questions, Only execution. The One Sith moved like machines now. Perfect efficiency. Absolute order. But Stryfe was beginning to hear something else beneath it all. A crack. Not in the walls. Not in the armor. In the air. He walked the halls of the temple after the meeting ended. His steps slow. Deliberate. He passed lower initiates who bowed quickly. None met his eyes. He didn't blame them. He remembered being one of them. Silent. Dead behind the eyes. Powerful, but hollow. Now, as he looked at them, he saw what he had become, and what he was still becoming. He entered the observation chamber, stood before the massive viewport that overlooked the stars. Endless. Empty. Beautiful. He hadn't stood here in years. Hadn't allowed himself to. Because it made him remember things he was never meant to keep. He took off his helmet, let it rest against his thigh, breathed. No sound, no audience, just himself. And in that space, in the quiet between battles, between orders, between roles, something inside him stirred. A voice, small, but real. This isn't you. It didn't scream, didn't beg. It simply spoke, and for the first time, he didn't silence it. He let it rise. He let the memory return of Had Abaddon, of the children he didn't kill, of the doctor he didn't stop, of the man he could have been. If someone had just asked him who he was, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full, full of choices he never made, paths he never took, names he never had. He didn't cry. Sith, don't cry. But his hands trembled, not from weakness, from restraint, from holding it all in for too long. The anger, the grief, the questions. He thought of Cade again. Not with envy, not with hate, with understanding. Cade burned because he refused to be shaped. And Stryfe, the most loyal servant of a master who devoured identities, was starting to wonder if he could still unshape himself. He left the chamber in silence. But something followed him. Not a voice, a decision. He still wore the armor, still gave orders, still killed when commanded. But now, behind the mask, he remembered. He remembered what it meant to stand still. Not because someone told him to, but because he chose to. The fire hadn't returned. Not fully, but it had begun to speak. And in that whisper, in that first breath of something other than silence, Darth Stryfe stopped being just a weapon. He became a man again. The Sith temple had always felt untouchable. Buried in the bowels of Coruscant, wrapped in shadow, veiled in fear it was never meant to be found, let alone attacked. And yet, it began with a tremor. Not through the Force, through durasteel. A deep, hollow vibration that echoed up through the floors and into the bones of those inside. Stryfe was the first to feel it. He was already awake, sitting alone in his quarters, unmoving, surrounded by silence. He thought at first it was memory, a dream still clinging to his skin. But then the alarms began. Low at first, then sharp. Red light washed through the corridors. Troopers scrambled. Doors slammed shut, and the temple, once a tomb of control, began to breathe like a beast preparing to be wounded. Stryfe stepped into the hall, helmet in hand. He didn't need a report, didn't need orders. He knew what was happening. They had been found, not by chance, not by accident, by intent. The resistance had grown bolder. Cade Skywalker had become more than a thorn. He had become a fuse, and someone had lit it. Stryfe moved quickly, not with panic, with clarity. He made his way to the inner spire, where the command center pulsed with crimson light and overloaded comms. Explosions rocked the lower levels. Outer defenses were failing. Reports came in Jedi signatures, confirmed. Cade was among them. He was not hiding anymore. He was bringing the fire to their heart. Stryfe barked orders to the defense grid, redirected troops, secured choke points. But deep inside, he already knew. The walls were cracking, not just in steel, in belief, because for all their power, for all their dominance, the One Sith had never prepared for the truth to arrive at their doorstep. And now that it had, they were splintering. Talon fought like a shadow down below. Nile had disappeared into the corridors. And Krayt, he hadn't spoken. He remained somewhere above, behind sealed chambers. Silent, watching, or waiting. Stryfe couldn't tell. But he didn't have time to wonder. He moved through the temple like a blade, cutting through infiltrators, clearing paths, locking down compromised zones. Yet, with every door sealed, more opened. The Jedi weren't just attacking. They were unraveling something. Stryfe felt it in the Force like pressure pulling in every direction at once. Not chaos. Correction. The galaxy was pushing back. And the temple, this place of silence and control, was not ready to hold it. He passed the shattered archives. Holocrons burned. Walls cracked. Symbols of dominance turned to smoke. And beneath his armor, something deeper cracked with them. Because this temple was not just a building. It was everything he'd given his life to. Everything he had obeyed without question. And now, it was falling. Not because the Jedi were stronger, but because the foundation had always been hollow, and no one had dared to admit it. Not until now. The temple groaned like a dying animal. Every wall seemed to bend under the weight of impact. Stryfe moved through smoke-filled halls that once felt eternal. Now they felt temporary, disposable, like the loyalty he had once believed would hold them together. He reached the northern corridor, just as the blast doors blew inward. 3 Jedi poured through the breach, lightsabers ready, expressions calm. Stryfe didn't hesitate. He struck like memory, fast, brutal, precise. The first fell quickly. The second held longer. The third forced him to remember. She was young, focused, unafraid. She moved like someone who had already accepted death. And that made her dangerous. Their blades met with violent grace. Each clash louder than the last. Each breath slower. But she didn't falter. Even when he drove her back against the wall. Even when her shoulder bled. She looked into his eyes and didn't see a monster. She saw a man. And Stryfe saw her seeing him. For a moment, he couldn't move. She hesitated just long enough to make a mistake. And he cut her down, clean, efficient, final. But when she hit the floor, he didn't feel stronger. He felt heavy. The way a blade feels when it's struck too many times, and begins to crack from the inside. He stepped over her body and kept walking. The air was thick with fire and debris. More Jedi pushed into the interior levels. Talon passed him in the lower atrium, drenched in blood, eyes wild with fury. She didn't speak. There were no words left to give. Stryfe reached the central hall, where the banners of the One Sith had once hung. They were gone now, torn, burned, replaced by light and silence. He heard a scream in the Force. Not pain, Krayt. It wasn't a voice. It was a roar, a rejection of what was happening, a refusal to die. The air around the temple cracked. Stone split. Windows exploded. But the attack didn't stop. The Jedi moved like water now, flowing through the weaknesses the Sith could no longer hide. Stryfe stood in the center of it all, armor scorched, breath shallow, saber dimming. He had always been the enforcer, the one who carried out the will of others. But now, with no will left to serve, he didn't know where to go. He turned toward the upper chamber, Krayt's last command post, and he ran, not with fear, with purpose, because if the temple was falling, he had to know why. He reached the staircase just as it collapsed behind him. The sound swallowed the whole. He climbed through smoke and stone, through memories that screamed from the walls. And at the top, as fire crawled through the cracks, he found the final door. It opened without resistance, and what he saw was not a throne, not a master, but the truth. And in that truth, the blade that had always obeyed began to break. The chamber was empty, no guards, no voices, no throne, only Krayt and Cade Skywalker. They stood facing each other in the ruin, the glow of their blades cutting through smoke and memory. Stryfe stepped inside, but neither of them turned. He didn't belong in this moment, not as a warrior, not as a witness, as something smaller, something older. A man who once believed that loyalty was protection, that obedience made you safe. And now, watching these two figures, one forged by silence, the other by defiance, he saw the lie for what it was. Cade's blade was steady, not raised in anger, raised in truth. He didn't need to win. He only needed to stand. Krayt's eyes burned with something worse than rage, certainty. He believed he had already won, that his survival, his power, his return, proved the Force itself had bowed. But the temple around him said otherwise, and Stryfe could feel it in the air. The end had already begun. The fight erupted before he could speak. It was fast, too fast for words, too fast for thought, just light and impact and breathless motion. Cade moved like instinct, Krayt like inevitability, and in every strike, Stryfe saw pieces of himself. The fire Cade refused to give up, the control Krayt refused to lose, and him, somewhere in between, a blade forged by both, and broken by both. He tried to move, to intervene, to act, but his legs felt heavy, not from wounds, from memory. He remembered every order, every purge, every surrender, and he remembered the day he stopped asking why. He hadn't protected the galaxy. He hadn't protected the Order. He hadn't even protected himself. He had served a vision that no longer saw him. The duel reached its crescendo, Krayt hurling Cade across the chamber, Cade landing hard, gasping, rising. And then, silence. For one breath, the Force held still, and Stryfe stepped forward, not to fight, to choose. He stood between them, two destinies crashing toward each other. Krayt raised a hand. Stryfe, he growled. A command, a warning. But this time, Stryfe didn't bow. He didn't kneel. He just stood. And in that moment, Krayt saw it, the hesitation, the fracture, the man inside the armor, and he struck. The lightning came without mercy, red, unforgiving. It tore through Stryfe's chest, lifted him from the floor, threw him against the far wall. His body collapsed. The chamber trembled, but Cade didn't pause. He moved forward, and Krayt turned to face the fire he could no longer put out. Stryfe lay in the corner, breathing shallow, vision dim, but his mind was clear. He had made no speech, no rebellion, no declaration, just a moment, a breath, a choice, and that was enough, because even if he could not protect the temple, or the Order, or himself, He had protected the one thing he had almost forgotten he still had. His voice. And in silence, it had spoken. The chamber was collapsing, not just from the battle, but from the weight of what had been held there for too long. Stryfe lay on the ground, unmoving, breathing shallow, vision flickering. He could hear them still. Krayt and Cade, power crashing against defiance, fury against freedom. But the sound was fading. His body was failing, but his mind had never been clearer. He thought it would end in glory, or in silence, but it was ending in something else. Understanding, he wasn't dying for a cause, not for Krayt, not for the Sith. He was dying for something he had never fought for. A moment of choice. He had not betrayed. He had not defected. He had simply stopped obeying. And, in doing so, he had become visible again. Not as a warrior, not as a blade, as a man. The pain was dull now, almost gentle. It reminded him of Ziost, of cold wind across cracked stone, of the way silence could freeze around you and still keep you alive. But he was not that boy anymore. He had survived every test, every purge, every scream, but he had never asked who he was beneath all of it. Not until now. He felt footsteps approach. Not heavy, not fast, slow, purposeful. Cade Skywalker knelt beside him. No saber in hand, no fire in his eyes. Only recognition. They didn't speak. There was no need. Because Cade saw it. The burn mark across Stryfe's chest. The refusal to kneel. The moment of defiance that had cost him everything. And Stryfe saw Cade too. Not the boy. Not the Jedi. Not the threat. The man who had never surrendered his name. Who carried the scars and still stood upright. He wanted to speak. To say one word. To ask one question. But there was no strength left. Only a breath. Cade placed a hand on his chest. Not to heal, just to honor. A gesture, not of victory, but of acknowledgement. Because Stryfe hadn't died a Sith. Not truly. He had died as the thing he had never been allowed to become. Free. The ceiling cracked. The chamber shook. Cade stood and walked away, his silhouette swallowed by dust and fading light. And Stryfe, left alone in the ruins of everything he once believed in, closed his eyes. There was no flash, no final scream, just silence. Not the silence of suppression, not the silence of obedience. A silence earned, and in that silence, a name long buried beneath armor, beneath titles, beneath commands, returned to him. He didn't speak it, didn't need to. He remembered, and in that memory, Darth Stryfe disappeared, not as a warrior, not as a blade, but as a boy who had survived the cold, fought for meaning, and died not in chains, but with his choice. He thought Krayt would return for him, even as the fire consumed the temple, even as his body lay broken beneath the fractured stone. Darth Stryfe waited, not for mercy, not for help, for acknowledgement. He had served the One Sith without question, obeyed orders without hesitation, fought battles without meaning, killed without reason. And in the end, when he had stood between Krayt and Cade Skywalker not with rebellion, but with silence, he thought that perhaps his master would see him, truly see him. But the throne room doors never opened again. No boots approached. No voice called his name. Only smoke, only ash. The last command Krayt had given him was to destroy the Jedi. And now the Jedi walked free. The temple lay in ruin. The Emperor had vanished. And Stryfe Stryfe remained exactly where his master had left him on the floor, dying, forgotten. There was no honor in it, no redemption, no last words, because redemption requires someone who believes you are worth more than your worst mistake. And Stryfe had never been given that chance. He had not fallen from grace. He had been shaped in the dark, used, sharpened, broken. He had no family, no legacy, no name beyond what Krayt had given him. Darth Stryfe, a title, a role, a tool, but not a man. He tried to remember the last time he had laughed, the last time he had questioned an order, the last time he had dreamed of something that wasn't destruction. There was nothing, only missions, only victories bought with blood, only the hollow satisfaction of surviving longer than those who hesitated. He had seen so many others fall. Darth Malevolent, Darth Cruel, even Darth Wylock the betrayer who had briefly stolen Krayt's throne. They all died with meaning, with identity, but not him. There would be no monument to Darth Stryfe, no Sith holocron bearing his thoughts, no apprentice whispering his name, because in the end, Krayt hadn't trained him to be a legacy. He had trained him to be disposable, a weapon forged in silence, and left to rust when it was no longer needed. Stryfe wanted to hate him for it, to curse the name of the man who had hollowed him out, but he couldn't, because deep down, he had asked for nothing more. He had accepted the mask, worn it proudly, become what they told him he was. And now, as blood filled his lungs and darkness crept into the corners of his vision, he understood the final cruelty. It wasn't pain, it wasn't betrayal, it was absence, the realization that his death would change nothing, that Krayt had already moved on, that the galaxy would barely remember the name of the enforcer who had done everything right, and still meant nothing. And so he lay there, beneath the rubble, in a chamber that once echoed with fear and power. Now it was quiet, not peaceful, just empty. He had always believed that if he obeyed well enough, fought hard enough, killed without question, someone would remember him. But the master never looked back, and neither did anyone else. There was no battlefield left, only ruins, only the still heat of extinguished fire clinging to broken stone. Somewhere above, the stars still moved. The war still raged. Krayt still hunted his obsessions. Cade Skywalker still walked a path no one understood. But here, beneath it all, Darth Stryfe was dying, and no one knew. His body was buried beneath what was once a temple. His armor cracked, his lungs shallow. Every breath felt like memory. He didn't fear death. He feared being forgotten, because death had always seemed distant, something reserved for the weak. And he was never weak, not when he drowned the Jedi Temple in the blood of his enemies. Not when he defied Wylock's false rule. Not even when Cade Skywalker refused to fall. But this death wasn't a duel. It wasn't righteous. It wasn't earned. It was quiet. And it was nameless. There would be no tale of his final stand. No recording in Sith archives. No whispers passed in back alleys by dark acolytes seeking to follow his path. Because he had no path. He had only orders. And when those orders ended, so did he. No one would speak of him in the centuries to come. No one would know the weight he carried. No one would wonder if he had ever questioned. But he had. Not aloud. Never aloud. Only in moments like this. When silence couldn't be avoided. When memory returned uninvited. He remembered his first kill, the first life he ended with his own hands. It hadn't been a Jedi. It had been another Sith, a rival, Someone Krayt had told him to remove, and he had done it without thought, without hesitation, because that was what strength meant, what loyalty demanded. But now, as darkness pressed in, he wondered what that rival's name was. He couldn't remember. The face, the voice, the reason all gone. Just another blade discarded after it had served its use. Just like him. He wondered how many others had died like this, in the shadows of their masters, believing they were part of something eternal, only to be buried in something temporary. The war was never about them. The power was never meant for them. He was part of a machine, and now the machine kept moving. Without him, he tried to lift his hand, to move something, anything, but his body didn't answer. Even the force, once loud in his veins, was fading. He had called on it so often, to strike, to kill, to destroy, but never to ask, never to wonder. He had used the force like a hammer. Now it slipped from him like water. He was not afraid, but he was small, not in size, in meaning. The galaxy didn't know he was dying, and it wouldn't care when he was gone. There would be no tomb, no statue, no shrine, only the rocks, only the dust, only this slow unraveling beneath a sky that would never say his name. And as his heartbeat slowed, as the last currents of power left his fingers, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not rage, not pain, loneliness. The kind that doesn't come from being alone. The kind that comes from realizing no one ever truly knew you. There had always been chains. Not around his wrists, not around his mind, but around something deeper. The part of him that once asked questions. He remembered the boy he used to be, taken from Ziost, handed to masters, stripped of identity. His name had been erased before he even understood what it meant. In its place, the title was given, Darth Stryfe. Not earned, assigned, and with it came a single command, obey. He obeyed through every war, every betrayal, every death. He obeyed when Krayt disappeared, when Wyalok ruled in his place, when the One Sith began to rot from the inside out. And even then, he never once asked for freedom, because freedom meant uncertainty. It meant risk. It meant standing alone. And Stryfe had never learned how to stand alone. Not truly. He was a soldier, not a seeker. A weapon, not a will. But now, buried beneath the rubble of the temple, his body broken, and the galaxy moving on without him, he realized something terrifying. He was free. No one was giving him orders. No one was watching. No one was expecting anything from him. He could think, feel, remember, and in that freedom, he felt more lost than ever. The One Sith had been his map, Krayt, his compass, obedience, his only direction. But now the map had burned. The compass had shattered, and he was adrift. He tried to summon hate, to cling to the rage that had always sustained him. But it didn't come, because hate needs an enemy, and for the first time in his life, he had no one left to hate. Not Cade Skywalker, not the Jedi, not even Krayt. All he had was silence, and in that silence, a memory stirred. It wasn't a battle, not a conquest, not a moment of power. It was a small thing. A moment he had buried long ago. A time when he was young, before the title, before the armor, before the voice of the dark side had ever spoken to him. He had escaped training just once, slipped out through a crack in the stone, found himself beneath a blood-red sky on Ziost's far ridge. The wind had been cold, the silence total, And in that brief moment, he had felt something he didn't yet have words for. Something vast, open, uncontrolled. It had terrified him. So he went back to the Sith, back to control, back to obedience, and he never left again. Until now, beneath tons of rock, with no commands to follow, no master to serve, he was back on that ridge. Not in body, in soul. And this time, the fear didn't come. Just breath, just stillness, just a second of knowing what it felt like to not belong to anyone. He would never rise again, never strike again, never speak again. But in that moment, in that flicker between life and death, he chose, not for Krayt, not for the Sith, not for vengeance, for himself. It was too late to live it, too late to become someone else, but not too late to know. He could have been more. He could not feel the Force anymore, not around him, not within him. It had left with the blood, with the strength, with the noise. Now there was only silence. But this silence was not cruel. It did not mock him, did not judge, did not ask why he hadn't been stronger. It just waited. He wasn't sure if he was breathing anymore, or if what he felt was just the echo of breath, the way a memory keeps moving even after the moment is gone. He didn't know what waited beyond death. He had always believed it would be pain, or darkness, or worse, nothing. But now, on the edge, he didn't find terror. He found stillness. It felt like the temple before dawn, when the rituals hadn't begun, when the screams hadn't started, when all that existed was dust in the air, and the quiet weight of ancient stone pressing in from every side. He had hated that silence then. Now, it held him like a cradle. He drifted inside it, no longer holding onto his title, no longer clinging to his failures. He remembered how the others died, some screaming, some pleading, some silent like him. But even in death, they had names, purposes, endings that others would speak of. But Darth Stryfe, no apprentice would mourn him, no master would speak of him, no legacy would carry his shadow. And yet, the silence did not erase him, because something remembered. Not a person, not a voice, something older, the Force, not the Jedi's light, not the Sith's hunger, something beneath both. It did not call him back, did not lift him up, but it did not forget. It held his presence, fragile as smoke, and gave it a shape, not to last, not to return, but to honor. He had been loyal, he had been ruthless, he had been lost, but in his final breath, he had seen the truth. He had never lived his life, only someone else's plan, and even that plan had forgotten him. He could feel his thoughts slowing now, like a fire burning down to embers. Not painful, just final. There were no regrets left, no more questions, only a single understanding. His life had been shaped by others, but this moment, this still, unspoken ending, belonged to him. No one could take it. Not Krayt, not the Sith, not history. Here, buried beneath stone and memory, he had become himself. Too late for legacy, too late for redemption, but not too late for truth. And when the last thought faded, when the silence truly claimed him, it did not consume. It remembered. The war ended in pieces, not with banners, not with music, not with peace, only silence. The One Sith, once whispered about in fear, had scattered. Their crimson robes, once symbols of control, became markers of ruin. Their ideology collapsed, their order dissolved, And like all wars in the galaxy, once it was over, no one looked back. There were treaties to sign, systems to rebuild, names to forget, and among the names lost to time was Darth Stryfe. No tomb, no headline, no ceremony, just a single body buried beneath the temple ruins on Korriban, covered in ash, stone, and the weight of a life never questioned. His story didn't end in glory. It didn't even end in betrayal. It ended the only way it could, with obedience, until the last breath. And no one came looking for him. No one asked where he'd gone. No one searched the ruins for a body. Because the galaxy didn't remember he had ever mattered. To the Jedi, he was just another Sith, a violent follower, an executor of death. To the Alliance, he was a name on a list, nothing more. And to the few Sith Lords who survived the fall of Krayt, he was a tool discarded when broken. They never said his name aloud again. That was the price of obedience. That was the cost of never becoming anything more than a servant. He had been feared once, respected. Some whispered that Stryfe was unbreakable, that he'd walk through fire if Krayt ordered it. And they were right. But even fear fades. Even monsters become forgotten when the nightmares are over. And what made it worse, what made it cruel, was that he never questioned why. Not once. He hadn't sought power for himself. He hadn't schemed like Wyalok. He hadn't craved legacy like Maladi. He hadn't fought for freedom like Cade Skywalker. He had followed, and followed, and followed, until there was no war left to fight, no master left to serve, and nothing inside him left to burn. When Krayt fell for the final time, when Cade drove his blade through the monster's heart, the galaxy exhaled. The shadow that had suffocated the stars lifted, but Stryfe was already gone. Not in that final battle, not in combat. He had died alone, earlier defending a temple that would not remember him, fighting for an order that no longer existed. He was not defeated by a Jedi. He was not betrayed by a Sith. He was forgotten by the very purpose that once gave him meaning. And yet, even in that, he had not screamed, had not wept, had not begged. He had closed his eyes, surrounded by dust, stone, and fire, and waited. Because that's what he had always done. Waited for orders, waited for permission, but none came. And in that final silence, he understood something he never had before. No one had ever truly seen him. Not the enemy, not his brothers, not his master. He had not been a warrior, not a man. He had been function, useful, disposable, replaceable. And when he fell, the galaxy proved it. No stories were told, no records filed, no Force ghost lingered. Even the Force seemed quiet, as if uncertain what to do with a life that had never truly lived. But in that quiet, something still remained. Not glory, not redemption. Something smaller, something truer. A memory, not of battles or commands, not of victories, but of freedom, the kind he had once glimpsed and never reached. The freedom of choosing his own path, of asking why, of walking away. He never had. And now, it was too late. The war had forgotten him, but the Force had not. And in its eternal memory, it held a place for the ones who never found themselves. Not to praise them, not to punish them, but to remind the galaxy of what blind loyalty costs. There is no marker, no stone, no inscription, no crypt sealed in honor. Just a collapsed section of the temple's southern wing, half buried in the scorched sands of Korriban, a place no one visits anymore. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is forgotten. This is where Darth Stryfe's body fell. and where it remained, there was no retrieval squad, no dark ritual to preserve his remains, no final gathering of Sith Lords to whisper his name into legacy. They left him there, crushed, burned, silent, and in time, the dust swallowed what was left. The temple, once the heart of Krayt's empire, became ruins. The statues shattered, the archives erased. The chambers collapsed inward like a wound refusing to close. And beneath one such wound, he rests, not in peace, not in torment, just in absence. The kind that lingers in places where power once stood, but meaning never did. Stryfe had never needed a monument. He wouldn't have asked for one. Wouldn't have dared to imagine his name etched beside the lords of old. He was not that kind of Sith. He was loyal. And in the One Sith, loyalty was not remembered. It was expected, demanded, taken. He died, fulfilling that demand. But not even the few who survived the purge returned to honor him. They ran. They hid. Some tried to rebuild. Others swore they had never known him at all. And so the grave remained nameless. The sand shifted. Time moved forward. And with it, history rewrote itself, erasing him line by line. But the Force does not forget. It echoes in the bones of the planet. It lingers in the broken stones. And beneath the rockfall, in a place where no light reaches, there is a whisper. Not a voice, not a cry, a memory. It remembers the heat of his last breath, the weight of his armor, the fire that once burned in his chest, and the silence that replaced it. It remembers a child taken too young, a warrior shaped too cruelly, a man who became an idea, and then a ghost. It is easy to forget Darth Stryfe, because he wanted to be useful, not seen. But even ghosts leave footprints. Even silence has a sound. And on worlds, like Korriban, that sound never truly fades. There are those who study the Sith. Academics, archaeologists. They dig through ruins looking for relics. They speak of Darth Krayt, of Maladi, of Wyerlock's betrayal, but never of Stryfe. There is no holocron with his voice, no teachings bearing his mark, no apprentices who survived to speak his name. And yet in the Force there is still something, an impression, like a scar left behind after a flame. He was not wise, not noble, not heroic, but he was real. And the Force, for all its will, never dismisses what is real. It holds the memory, keeps the shape of him, just as it does with all those who were lost before they could choose who they were. This is the kind of grave that speaks only to those who already know what it means. It does not stand tall. It does not shine. It does not call. It waits for silence to be noticed, for obedience to be questioned. In the ancient Sith teachings, there were always warnings about ambition, betrayal, weakness, about the Jedi, about peace, about attachments, but never about loyalty. Because to the Sith, loyalty was power, until it wasn't, until it became something else. A chain, a blindfold, a grave with no name. Stryfe wore that chain willingly, tightened the blindfold with his own hands, walked toward the edge without hesitation, because he thought that was strength, and for a time it was, until it wasn't, until the day no one remembered why he'd fought, or what he'd died for, only that he was gone. Beneath the temple stones there is no light, no air, only dust. But the Force moves there still, not as storm, not as fire, as memory, and in that memory, Stryfe remains. Not as Sith, not as legend, but as a question, a warning wrapped in armor. a lesson carved into ruin. What becomes of the man who never disobeyed? What becomes of the servant when the master is gone? The galaxy does not ask, but the Force does, and it does not forget. He never asked why. From the moment he was taken, from the moment his name was stripped away, from the moment Darth Krayt looked into his eyes and saw a weapon, instead of a boy, Stryfe followed. He followed orders. He followed pain. He followed power. But he never questioned, not when he was told to kneel, not when he was ordered to kill, not when the temple halls echoed with screams. He believed that loyalty was strength, that obedience was the highest form of will, that to serve without hesitation was proof of his place in the Sith Order. And for a long time, it was. Krayt rewarded loyalty. He made Stryfe a hand of the Empire, gave him command, gave him power, gave him purpose, but never gave him truth. And Stryfe never asked for it, because the truth was dangerous. The truth required choice, and choice required something he had been trained to bury: doubt. It had stirred once on Ziost. Before the training, a flicker of it when he saw a child cry as their home was burned. But he pushed it down. They were enemies. He was a Sith. He believed it. He had to. Because if he didn't, the rage inside him, the fire he carried, would have nowhere to go. So he aimed it where he was told, burned the worlds he was pointed toward, and never asked why. Even when the Empire fractured, even when Wylock betrayed Krayt, even when the Jedi refused to die, he never questioned the mission. He questioned himself. Why was he still alive when so many others had fallen? Why did pain return in moments of silence? Why did the boy inside him still remember the sound of his mother's voice? But he never voiced those questions. Not to his masters, not to himself. Because asking meant breaking something inside. Something fragile, something carefully buried. And Stryfe was not ready to break. Not until it was too late. The first real crack came when Krayt returned. Not as the man he once was, but something darker, something twisted. The others celebrated. But Stryfe looked into his master's eyes and saw nothing human. He followed still. But something had changed. Orders felt colder. Missions felt hollow. Victories felt meaningless. And the fire that had once driven him began to flicker. That's when he saw Cade Skywalker. Not just the warrior, not just the threat, but the choice. Cade didn't obey, didn't bow, didn't follow any path but his own. And Stryfe for the first time envied him. Not because Cade was strong, but because Cade was free. Free to walk away, free to refuse, free to fall, and still rise again. Stryfe had never known that kind of freedom. He had only known control. But by the time he saw the cost of his silence, it was already too late. He had killed too many, obeyed too long, built himself too deep into the machine to escape it. And when Krayt sent him to die, he did, without a question, without a word. And that was the final cost. Not death, but the silence before it. The silence that echoed with all the things he had never said. What do I believe? What is this war for? Who am I, if not your weapon? He died with those questions still locked in his chest. And the galaxy never heard them. But the Force did. It always does. It listens in ways no master ever can. And when the body breaks, the soul speaks. Stryfe's soul was not filled with hatred, not with pride, but with regret. Not because he had served, but because he had never lived. Because he had spent every breath becoming something others wanted, and never asked what he wanted to be. Not even once. The Jedi warn against attachment. The Sith warn against weakness. But neither speak of silence. The kind that eats away at a man from within. The kind that leaves him loyal, but empty. Stryfe was not betrayed. He was not defeated in battle. He was forgotten. And that, too, was the cost of never asking. The cost of never choosing. Because when you do not choose who you are, others will choose for you. And when they are gone, as they always are, you are left with nothing. Nothing but echoes. And a body no one remembers. But the Force remembers. It carries every unspoken word. Every question buried too deep. Every truth that died behind closed eyes. And in that remembering, Stryfe still lingers. Not as a Sith, not as a warrior, but as a lesson. The cost of never asking is not failure. It is absence. A life lived in shadow. A name lost to dust. A grave with no story. But stories do not have to be told. They only need to be heard. And the Force hears everything. In the final days of the Sith Temple, long after the battles were over and the flames turned to ash, the hallways were silent. Not with peace, but with vacancy. There were no footsteps, no commands, no voices to raise in anger or triumph. Only stillness. Only dust. That was the echo Darth Stryfe left behind. Not one of glory. Not even of fear. But of obedience. A perfect, obedient shadow that moved as it was told. Killed as it was told. Died as it was told. And never once resisted. Some believe legacies are forged through power. That to shape the galaxy, you must dominate it. Others believe legacies are carved by rebellion, by choosing a path no one else dares walk. Stryfe did neither. He obeyed. And for that, his legacy is not a story retold but a lesson often ignored. There is no mural for Darth Stryfe, no legend passed down in Sith teachings, no dark holocron inscribed with his voice. Because obedience does not inspire. It repeats. It lingers in those who come after, in their silence, their submission, their belief that power lies in being chosen, instead of choosing. Long after Stryfe's death, the galaxy moved on. Cade Skywalker disappeared into myth. The One Sith fell. Krayt's resurrection meant little in the face of time. But across ruined worlds, broken temples, forgotten war zones, the pattern endured. Acolytes trained to listen, not think. Lords demanding loyalty, not understanding. And every time one knelt without question, they repeated Stryfe's life. And his death. That is the quiet tragedy of obedience. It does not stop when the obedient are gone. It survives in those who never knew their names, only their footsteps. There is a question the Sith rarely ask, a dangerous one. What if loyalty is not power, but fear? Fear of the unknown, fear of choice, fear of becoming more than what someone else imagined for you. Stryfe never asked that, because by the time he could, it was already too late. His end was not cinematic, not redemptive, not even defiant. He died as he lived, certain of his master's will, and uncertain of his own soul. But even in that, the Force listened. It always listens to the forgotten. Because the Force is not a weapon, not a code, not a master. It is memory. It holds the weight of every life. Not just the powerful ones. Not just the loud ones, but the silent ones. The ones who never had the words. Darth Stryfe was not a Sith Lord who changed the galaxy. But he was a man who showed what happens when you let others decide who you are. He began as fire. Burning, wild, broken. But was taught to bury it. To obey. To extinguish his will. And in doing so, He became useful, then disposable, then forgotten, yet even that has meaning. Because when we remember Darth Stryfe, we remember every servant who never spoke, every warrior who never broke the chain, every soul that died still asking for permission to live. We remember that silence can kill, that loyalty without understanding is not strength but surrender. And we remember that even in the deepest shadow, something still watches, something remembers. The Force, it does not forget the obedient. It mourns them. In a ruined hall, beneath a broken roof, where stone meets dust and light never reaches, there is no voice. But if there were, it might say, ask, before it is too late, before your name is gone. Because in the end, Strife's legacy is not about war, not about death. It's about a life lived under command, and a soul that never learned to command itself. The Sith believed they could shape the future through power. But in Darth Stryfe, we see the danger of shaping a person without purpose. The danger of turning fire into silence, of turning freedom into function, and of confusing loyalty for meaning. He followed the Sith code. He followed his master. He followed every order, and died never knowing who he truly was. That is the echo he left behind. That is the final sound, the one the Force carries quietly into the long night. Obedience echoes forever, but it does not speak your name, not unless you choose it yourself.